summer, I did a podcast episode on every NFL shutout that I'd researched. I pulled together a spreadsheet of every NFL shutout since 2000, and then what happened to the team that was shut out in the next game. Did they win? Did they lose? Was it on the road? Was it home? Was the shutout loss at home or on the road? What happened the rest of the season in terms of points scored, points given up? Trying to show whether there is some kind of relationship between getting shut out and some shift in production or some shift in wins. For fantasy purposes, I was more interested in production. How many points are they scoring per game after a shutout versus before the shutout in the season? Very interesting stuff. To me anyway, it's stuff that I use as, tiebreaker type research. It's not the kind of research where you say, oh my gosh, team gets shut out and boom, they go bonkers the next 7 games. It doesn't work like that, but there's slight bumps that occur. I also have research that I haven't talked about, that's just for 3 years, 2021, 2022, and 2023. It's a lot of time spent researching this stuff. But that's why I have only 3 years. But it's rematches. Every single player, in those 3 years, the game 1 that they had against the team and then what they did game 2, and then comparing the fantasy production. So if you have Tony Pollard, for when he played for the Cowboys, he faces, the Giants, in game 1 a few years ago. What did he do? And then face them game 2. What did he do there? Was it a win in game 1 and then a loss in game 2? Was it a loss and then a win? All of that stuff factored in. What it shows is that in rematches, especially after a loss, there is a bump, a tangible bump in production, particularly for players who are getting roughly 10 plus points per game. In other words, they're somewhat streamable, except quarterback, but somewhat streamable if they're running back, wide receiver, especially tight end. And so they matter from a fantasy perspective. And those guys, in general, are getting 2-3 point bumps on average when they lose game 1 to a team and then they face them in a rematch. It's the same thing also. It's even a hyper bump if it's a loss on the road and then they play them at home in that game too. There's a really nice bump, especially for those high producing guys. I bring this up because in week 3, the Panthers shut out the Falcons 30-0. The week before, Atlanta had, I thought, it seemed, upset the Vikings in Minnesota. I think it was like 22-6. It was a comfortable win, and Atlanta looked like they were poised to compete in the NFC South. As it turns out, they are not. They're ranked 3rd, just ahead of the Saints, and the Panthers are, I think, 2 games up on Atlanta. And so the Panthers handed it to the Falcons. You had Bijan Robinson did about as much as he could do on 17, 18 touches. He had solid fantasy points, I think 15 fantasy points. Drake London was just okay. And Darnell Mooney got involved, and, it was just kind of neutral. You didn't get much out of those guys, mostly because they didn't score. Now the question is, we've got game 2, and we go back to the research. And I've circled that loss because I wanted to see, does this research, is this practical enough? Is this actionable enough where I can look ahead to week 11 and say, the Falcons, they're more likely than not to rebound. And if they rebound, we should expect some, meaningful bumps for these players. I don't think if Drake London is questionable as of late Friday night, if he plays, he's not going to necessarily do better than his season average in terms of points scored. He's crushing it. But he'll probably do better, and I would bet on him doing better as long as he's active than what he did in game 1 in week 3 against the Panthers. Same thing with Bijan Robinson. I would bet on 20 plus points for Bijan Robinson. I think that just the way these trends work in terms of rematches coming off a loss, and you factor in the shutout, I think there's a real chance that the Falcons take it to the Panthers this week, and that's why I had it circled. I think Atlanta's defense, their DST, if you use DST, I think Atlanta's DST is probably top five this week. I think this is the win or you're done kind of game for the Falcons. And this is also a matter of, wow, they couldn't play much worse than they did against Carolina last time. They're going to make adjustments and figure out how to beat what is a somewhat beatable Panthers team. Bryce Young has not looked great, and they have one reliable receiver in Titeroa McMillan. They have a fantastic running back in Rico Dowdle, but I don't think Dowdle can do it on his own. And the fact is, the Panthers, if their running game is not dominating, they're going to have a lot of trouble moving the ball, in my opinion, against Atlanta. So this is one of those cases where we're testing it to see if it's actionable. Week 3, the shutout happens. I look ahead to week 11. I say, well, if I can, somehow trade for Bijan Robinson, good luck with that. I made an offer, I remember at one point, I think for Kyle Pitts, some kind of deal. Didn't get that. I was looking ahead thinking there's going to be some bump in week 11, and I want to be a part of that if I get fair market value. So if you have any of those guys, if Drake London does start, obviously, that's an easy one. But with Pitts and Bijan Robinson is an automatic start, but you're getting more points, in my opinion, than you would have gotten if they had beaten the Panthers handily in week 3. We'll never know the answer to that, but year after year, after shutout losses, we see teams get slight bumps in their next game. And in those 3 years, fairly consistently, we see good players, get bumps coming off a loss in game 1 when they go into game 2. Something to keep in mind. And this is why I encourage all managers to think about what is your competitive edge. Do you have any research? Is there anything you've been tracking where it's not just anecdotal? You're not just borrowing someone else's. You're not just looking at game tape and saying, well, there's the answer. I think historical data paints a picture about the psychology of player performance. What goes into the mindset of a team that has, just had a shutout loss in week 3, and not just, but 2 months earlier, and going ahead to week 11 saying, what can they do differently? Because whatever they did in week 3 didn't work. I think that's an actionable way to look at fantasy rather than just rolling the dice on a week-to-week basis in a vacuum. I'm BJ Riddell, Fantasy Football for Winners. Follow me on the blog. You know me anytime.